Let's begin, guys. Let's begin. Frankfurt Airport, we are underway. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, this is our fourth speedrun. For those watching on YouTube, the premise of this speedrun is going to be a focus on openings. I'm going to play the openings that I officially recommend to the majority of players, beginner and intermediate. Throughout the speedrun, I will stick to the same openings, and in our game analysis, we're going to focus more heavily on opening theory and developing the recommended repertoire. I will be making opening mistakes, but in every game, we're going to put the accent on making sure that we are developing our opening knowledge. And against the French, as those of you who've watched previous speedruns know, I recommend the Nimzowitsch French. That's the official name. For the first 10, 15 games, we're going to get almost no opening theory, and that in and of itself is also very instructive, because if you're a beginner watching this, you should know how to punish typical openings that beginners play, even if they're not theoretical. So already the move knight c6 is a non-theoretical move. It's obviously not the main move. The main move is d5, but it's important already at the outset. Let me just enable arrows. It's important already at the outset to avoid assuming that just because a move like knight c6 is played, you're somehow like already winning. Against most of these, random developing moves, you want to just respond by developing your pieces. Of course, d5 is possible, but we don't have any of our pieces developed yet. I think d5 is a little bit too concrete. I think the simplest is just to continue our development with knight f3. And when we get more pieces out, we'll start contemplating moves like d5 or e5 in response to knight f6. Actually, e5 might be more reasonable. So our opponent is thinking d6, all right. And again, a passive setup by our opponent, but nothing egregiously bad. And we have many ways that we can, quote unquote, punish such a setup. The most simple move is knight c3. Some of you are thinking, let's control more of the center with the move c4. Also a totally reasonable move. It depends on your taste. Some people like a greater share of the center. Some people like more of an emphasis on piece development. Since we're playing 1e4, I think it's more in the spirit of e4 openings to not play c4. When you play c4, that's almost like playing 1d4 and 2c4. We're going to play this as absolutely primitively as possible. Just go knight c3. Okay, our opponent basically pre-moves knight f6. As you might know, in such positions, I like for the bishop to come out to d3. And the reason I like the d3 square is it does a couple of things. It reinforces the pawn on e4, but also when black castles kingside, we can push this pawn out to e5, and the bishop is going to be aiming at the h7 pawn. Now, if you're kind of newer to chess, you might say, well, okay, I can see that, but isn't that pawn and now that square going to be protected? Well, it is going to be protected by the black king from g8, but there's a typical idea where that's called a battery, where the bishop remains on d3 and the queen later travels to the e4 square. Now, if you can visualize that in your head, bishop on d3, queen on e4, when black is castled kingside, these two pieces are aiming at the h7 square, and that is a major mate threat. So even though black has removed the pawn from h6, it doesn't mean that black has fixed the problem on the underlying square. So don't confuse, there's like two separate things. There's weak pawns, but even if a pawn moves away, the square itself might also be valuable as it is here. Okay, so we should continue our development, and we should do so just by castling kingside. I mean, we're making the most standard developing moves imaginable. We are not afraid of the move knight to b4. Knight to b4 is a sort of, it's not even a threat, but we can always move the bishop back and then chase the knight away with a3. Okay, b6. So at this point, the move, what strikes me about the move b6 is that our opponent is not taking care of his or her kingside development, right? The bishop remains on f8, and they're not even moving their bishop out to d7, and this just seems to be something that we can try to punish. Now, I say this word punish, and I'll say this word a lot as we climb the sort of initial ranks. What does it mean to punish slow development or bad development in the opening? Well, generally what you should associate that word with is opening up the center. When you open up the center, you open up files and you open up direct pathways, not only to your opponent's king, but mostly to your opponent's king and also to your opponent's loose pieces. So a lot of you might be tempted by the move bishop b5 here, pinning the knight, now that the knight is unprotected. But how is black going to defend against bishop b5? And a question geared more toward newer players who should be not afraid to contribute in the chat. It's okay to make mistakes. That's the point of the speedrun, to make typical mistakes and discuss them. So what happens after bishop b5? So you might think, I read about this move. This is called a fianchetto. That's where you open up a little square for your bishop. But bishop b7 is a mistake after bishop b5 because the knight is going to be pinned. We can advance the pawn to d5. I'll show this after the game. And the knight on c6 is lost. So after bishop b5, can you defend the knight and simultaneously unpin it? You can. You can bring the bishop out to d7. And it turns out that the move bishop b5 is then kind of a waste of a tempo. Let's refrain from that move and let's instead focus on opening up the center. When black pushes these pawns to d6 and e6, he creates hooks. And a hook is kind of a pawn that you can use as dynamite. You can advance your own pawn up to a certain square, and it creates the effect of dynamiting the center. It forces your opponent to either trade opening up a file or allow you to trade for their pawn. Either way, the center opens up, the king is weakened. So what move resembles that kind of dynamiting operation? There's actually two moves that get the job done, but only one of them opens up the file that we really want to open, which is the E file. Yeah, let's go D5. And this is a super typical operation. This is the process of opening up the center. If black plays E takes D5, we have two defenders on the square. Black has two attackers. This move is safe. Even if it was a pawn sacrifice, we'd still play it, because this E file is the pathway, the direct pathway to black's king, and this is why it's so important to castle early. Okay, we obviously take back with the pawn, and we have achieved a major step toward winning this game. And I'll explain after the game like why I knew to play D5 and not E5, but for now let's continue. Knight B4. Now we sort of need to conceptualize our objective here. So our primary objective is to keep black's king locked in the center. The worst case scenario is to allow black to play bishop out to e7 and castle kingside. Not that that necessarily solves all of black's problems, but ideally we would like to keep black's king confined to the center. It's hard to shoot at a moving target. And if the king escapes to the kingside, it's going to be much harder to set up the attack. We'll have to start from square zero. Okay, so how do we prevent black from castling? It seems inevitable that bishop e7 is going to happen, and bishop e7 is inevitable. We can't prevent that move. What we can say is, okay, we can put the rook on e1. That's a check. Bishop will come out to e7. The bishop is pinned. And then we just apply more pressure on the bishop. And by doing so, we force black's king to remain in the center as a defender. So how do we do that? Well, we play rook e1 check, and then we put the queen on e2. We create another battery. We stack these two pieces, and we aim putting pressure on the bishop. But before we do that, let's throw in the move bishop b5 check, just so that we don't have to deal with the headache of this trade. I also like our light squared bishop. I think it's a valuable piece because it's controlling and pressuring all of these weak light squares that have been weakened with the move b6. And even if you're newer to the game, you should kind of intuitively understand what that means, right? The move b6 literally creates holes all over the queen side, and so it's worth preserving the light squared bishop. Well, now we need to follow through on our plan, but we need to be very precise in how we accomplish it. And now that I'm thinking about this situation more soberly, I realize that we can basically win a piece. And the way that we can win a piece, I'll make the first move without explaining. The first move is just a grab on d7. Black's best move is actually king takes d7. I don't see anybody making this move essentially under 2,000. Yeah, queen takes d7. And how did I see that? What did I see? The e file being open is not the only thing that I notice. There's also the question of this knight on b4. You might look at this and say, okay, well, there's a knight on b4. Why is it so interesting? That knight on b4 is incredibly vulnerable because minor pieces that are just sort of sitting on your side of the board are vulnerable to attacks by pawns. And you should have this instinct to push the knight away with the move a3. And you should want to do that regardless of what your follow-up is. But you'll notice that the knight has to go back to a6. I mean, it can take the pawn, but then white loses the knight. And after the knight goes back to a6, one of the most important acronyms that I've shared in previous speedruns, and I will try not to repeat myself too many times. I'm assuming that you have seen the previous speedruns, LPDO, loose pieces drop off. Pieces that are not defended by any pawns or any other pieces are massive liabilities. And when you combine a loose piece with a wide open king, you get a double attack or a fork. The king can be checked and the loose piece can be simultaneously attacked. I've already pointed out the correct move in another context, but now you should see that the knight is weak, the king is exposed. That's fork central, and a ready-made fork exists with queen e2 check. Forget the e-file. Instead, we just win the knight on a6, and we will be up a full piece. Notice the sort of flexibility in my thinking. I was starting out by contemplating how to prevent black from castling. As I was doing that, I noticed that there's this move rook e1 check and there's queen e2 check, both moves operating down the e-file. But I also noticed a second flaw in black's position, the fact that the knight on b4 was incredibly vulnerable, and those two observations led me to find the fork. And we win the knight, and we essentially win the game. We're up a full piece. We have let black castle, though, so there's a downside, but it was worth winning the piece. Once again, when you win a piece, from a very general standpoint, there's sort of two ways to convert a material advantage. And this is also something I've talked about at length. The typical prescribed method is to simplify. The logic behind that is that the more pieces you trade, the more tangible your material advantage is going to be. I think the analogy that I've made previously is if you consider a soccer game where a player gets a red card, it's 11 men on 10. And somebody comes along and says, let's just remove 10 players from the soccer field. You're just going to get a 1 on 0. If you're up a knight and you remove all the other pieces on the board and just leave pawns, the knight is going to be, a total. You're going to have a monopoly on the board. If you have only one minor piece, that minor piece dominates. In the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed man, in the world of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. So that's the logic behind simplifying. And if we wanted to simplify, we could grab the pawn on b5 with the queen, pinning the queens and trading the queens. Let's start out, since this is our first game, by playing as simply as possible. We're going to play queen takes b5. That's not what I would do in a classical game. If I had this with white, I would keep the queens on the board. That is a faster winning mechanism. We want to lay the groundwork properly, and we're just going to start by playing simple chess. Nothing wrong with queen takes b5. If you're watching this on YouTube and you're like, these explanations are super long-winded, I get it, but please understand that this is the first game. I have a lot of groundwork to lay. I want to bring people up to speed who haven't seen previous speedruns, and remember that my level of explanations are largely tailored to where we're at in the speedrun. So you're just going to have to be patient if you're a stronger player. Okay, c6 is just a terrible move because we have two attackers on that square and only one defender. We can take with either piece. We can take with a pawn. That is the move that I would play in a real game. But of course, let's adhere to our strategy and let's take back with a queen. We're going to stick to the strategy of forcing simplification just because I want to show you how that kind of works and why it's so much simpler to win positions when the queens are sort of off the board. So queen takes c6 is very nice. Russian school. Yeah, this is like Soviet school. We trade all the pieces, we win simple chess. This is not how you paint pictures, but this is definitely how you win games. Yeah, and of course, if our opponent castles, then we will take his queen. Queen c6, we play dc. And then we defend that pawn, potentially with the move knight f3 to d4. Rook c8. Okay, so obviously we trade. And now we haven't completed our development yet. Just because the queens are off the board doesn't mean that simple principles go out the window. We have a bishop on c1. That bishop isn't out yet. Where should we put it? Well, I'm seeing that the pawn on a7 is undefended. So we have a very natural developing move. Just play bishop e3, attacking the pawn. That gains a tempo. Yeah, bishop e3 is definitely better than the alternative. And bishop f4, biting on granite, stares at a pawn that's well defended. Bishop d2 is just passive. So bishop e3 makes the most sense. And it's important to be patient when you're converting even vast material advantages. Chess is this weird thing where you can be up like a piece or a rook, And you won't be able to checkmate in the next like 5 moves. You'll have to slowly and gradually accumulate your advantages until at one point you win more material or something just gives. So many ways we can do this. What I wouldn't play is knight b5. That's impulsive. That's rushing it. You're giving up the c2 pawn and you're letting black get active. So you might say, well, then let's play rook a to c1 and protect the pawn so that we prepare knight b5. But that's bad for 2 reasons. It's a bad use of resources. You don't want to use a whole rook for the small task of protecting a pawn. The second thing is that you're telegraphing your pass. It's like in basketball, you're holding the ball over your head. You're looking at who you're about to pass it to. Rook ac1 gives black ample time to protect against knight b5. The other rook could come out to b8. A much more efficient and multifaceted way of doing the same thing is to bring this knight over to d4, as many of you are suggesting. Very good. Knight d4 is just a nice, solid move. It centralizes the knight. The knight's controlling more squares. We're threatening to travel to b5 with this knight, keeping the other knight for the purpose of protecting d5. We can also aim for the c6 square. That's called an outpost. An outpost is a square deep in your opponent's territory that is protected by a pawn, and generally an outpost is considered unassailable. The piece on an outpost cannot be kicked away by any of your opponent's pawns. It can still be traded off the board by one of your opponent's minor pieces, but there are no pawns that could assail the knight on c6. Okay, this is a good move. And of course, if we push our pawn to b4, we blunder the knight on c3. The pawn is defending the knight. So here, we could play knight d to b5, but black's rook slides over to b7, and then the knight will be under fire. So the simplest is just to play rook a b1. And if you're attentive, you'll say, wait a second, didn't you just say that this is not a very good use of your resources? But nothing I say is a dogma. Here, it's just sort of a necessity. Like, we have to play rook a b1, but this is not a permanent state of affairs. We're doing this just to protect the pawn. We might go knight c6 on the next move, and we might attack the black rook on b8. Okay, so here it's all purely academic. We are up a piece, so violating these basic principles doesn't really matter. We're going to win this game one way or the other. Hopefully, I'm making sense. And as you're initiating your chess journey, you have to understand that chess is this very interesting interplay between these general rules that you're supposed to follow as you're starting out, like don't do this instead. This is how you develop your pieces. This is how you position your pawns. And you just have to understand that these are general guiding principles, but they are very frequently violated. And the better you become, the more you realize when they should be violated. When you're a beginner, you should mostly adhere to principles, but you should just understand conceptually, even if you don't understand it like concretely, that often principles should be violated in certain types of positions. Yeah, this is a free rook. So the bishop aims at the rook. This is called an X-ray. An X-ray is when one of your pieces stares at one of your opponent's pieces, and there's a piece between them. It can be your piece, it can be your opponent's piece. An X-ray is just sort of a general term. But an X-ray is tightly associated with what's called a discovered attack. So imagine that scenario. You have one of your pieces, a bishop. It's aiming at one of your opponent's pieces, a rook, normally more valuable. There's a piece in the middle, the knight. So the logic is that the knight can move out of the way. That's called a discovered attack. And well, where should that hypothetical knight move? Well, it would be nice if the knight could move onto a square such that the knight itself also creates a threat. Then we have the threat of the bishop against the rook, and we have the threat posed by the piece that's moving away, the knight. We couple that with the fact that we already know where the knight belongs. It belongs on the c6 square, right? All of those things come together. Now you might say, well, I just broke this down and belabored a very simple point. Yeah, that's because your pattern recognition is already, the neurons are firing and you see this move immediately. If you're newer to chess, this is a move which can be arrived at through pure logic, but you might not necessarily see it straight away. If you're newer to chess, you should focus on noticing X-rays between your pieces and your opponent's valuable pieces. Anytime a queen stands in the diagonal of one of your bishops, anytime a rook does the same, anytime one of your rooks X-rays one of your opponent's queens, those are precursors to simple tactics. You know, even though you're not going to see a lot of stuff when you're starting out, you can at least begin to notice things based on like a checklist, right? It's not hard to notice stuff when you already know what to look for. Rook takes d5. Okay, this is total collapse. Now, obviously, we have some order of operations questions. Knight takes d5 is possible, but we should start by taking the other rook because that's a check and that's just a free rook. And then we're going to take the rook on d5. Quaternion says there's no openings at 400 elo. That's not true. We're not going to talk opening theory for the first couple hundred points that extensively, but we are going to talk opening concepts and ways of punishing bad openings. Okay, so now we're up 2 rooks, and I can kind of stop commentating, but I'm not going to. There's no reason not to take another pawn on a7. That's just a free pawn. And as I've said many times, the simplest way to convert a position like this, where you're up like an unholy amount of material, is actually just to make another queen. Just push your passed pawns, right? Rather than using your 2 rooks to try to checkmate the black king. The problem is that there are other minor pieces on the board. Okay, here there's an exception to the rule. Again, we see a small tactical pattern. There's a king. There's a piece that's behind the king. That is asking to be skewered. And of course, there's an easy skewer with rook fe1 check. Notice that the knight is protecting the d7 square. Just because you're up a ton of material doesn't mean you shouldn't take more free pieces. Yeah, our opponent sadly is investing too much time in this defensive effort, but obviously the game is over. Okay, 94. Our opponent is giving away all of their pieces. Okay, king f6. What should we do now? Who can tell me? There's at least 2 moves that win the bishop. Another construction that you should be noticing early and often is anytime a king defends a piece, and a king is the only defender, that is an incredibly unstable situation because the king can be checked, and when it's checked, it must move by rule. So knight d7 is indeed the simplest move. We disattach the king from the bishop. The other way to do it, of course, was bishop d4 check. These moves accomplish exactly the same thing, forcing the king to move and winning the bishop. That's why I outline these 2 designations, type 1 and type 2 undefended pieces. Type 1 undefended piece is a piece that is not protected by any other pieces or pawns. And again, the simplest path is just to push your pawn and create a queen, right? A queen is by far the fastest piece with which to deliver checkmate. You can do it with your rooks and stuff, but this is even faster. A type 1 undefended piece is a piece that's not protected by any other pieces or pawns. We'll talk about that. Type 2 undefended piece is a piece that is only protected by one other piece. So if a piece is protected even by one pawn, it's considered fully defended. But if a bishop is defended only by the king, it's a type 2 undefended piece. And type 2 undefended pieces are often overlooked by Easy Tiger. Type 2 undefended pieces are overlooked frequently by players because they assume that, oh, that piece is defended. But if a piece is only one defender, that defender can be dislodged, it can be attacked, it can be deflected and distracted. And then the type 2 undefended piece becomes a fully undefended piece. So again, you might be looking at this and saying, well, this is overkill. I'm like really over-explaining everything. This is incredibly obnoxious. But remember, again, we are laying the groundwork. And when we lay it carefully, I'll be able to refer to these concepts later when they actually matter against stronger players. Okay, here I'm not commenting because I'm just taking stuff and delivering checkmate. Yeah, let's take the pawn and queen g4 is made on the next move. Okay, great. All right, so our first speedrun game, folks, is in the books. Congratulations, everybody, on celebrating this momentous occasion with me. So a quick look at the game. Of course, knight c6 already is a deviation from the theory. This is what's called the French defense. And in the French, the idea of e6 is to support the move d5. This is the cousin to the Caro-Kann, that's c6 and d5. If you've watched chess for any amount of time, you've seen one, probably both of these openings. And we'll talk about the French separately when we face it for the next time. Knight c6 is not a great move because black is kind of mixing 2 opening strategies, right? If you're bringing your knight out to c6, well, it's much better to then control a bigger share of the center with a move e5. Knight f3, knight c6. This is, of course, the main opening in chess. To play e6 and knight c6 just gives up a bunch of center. That knight on c6 is incredibly vulnerable to the move d5 later on in the game. So we continue with simple development, knight f3, d6, and knight c3. Continuing simple development. There are many, many ways to cement the advantage here. A lot of you pointed out c4, getting a bigger share of the center and making d5 even more likely, totally possible as well, but we decided to play this more primitively. It also blocks the c pawn. Yeah, you often see black pushing the pawn up to c5, as he does in the Sicilian, to contest white's center. So black has given up full control over the center and blocked in his bishops. It's just incredibly passive. That's the best word to describe black's opening play. It's passive. Okay, so knight f6, and now bishop d3, which I explained during the game. And just to show you a hypothetical, let's say black plays bishop e7, which would have been the proper move. Castles, castles. The point of putting the bishop on d3 is eventually we will play the move e5. And this is, I think somebody mentioned, I never know whether to play d5 or e5. Well, here we play e5 for a very specific reason. We open up the bishop. You might say, okay, well, there's going to be a trade on e5. Let's say black drops the knight back to d7. Now, I pointed out that the bishop alone is not that impressive of a piece, but combine it with a queen on e4, and you already have a mate threat against h7. And you might say, well, okay, but black can defend against that mate threat. That's true, but if black defends against that mate threat, pushing a pawn in front of your king creates weaknesses. Those weaknesses can be occupied by other pieces. You can already see the attack kind of unfolding. So this is a very sort of straightforward idea that you should keep in mind. Now, there are modifications that you can make. You can start with the move queen e2. This is where we get into kind of finesse and subtlety, preparing e5. When do you play stuff immediately? When do you prepare it? One of the biggest questions in chess. But hopefully this makes sense. h6 is another subpar move, and b6 really, I would say this may be even the decisive mistake. Like after d5, I already think black is all on the cusp of being lost. Of course, the correct approach for black would have been to urgently complete the kingside development. Yeah, so d5 is crushing. ed. Now, a question for the more advanced players. How should black respond here? Because knight b4 essentially loses a piece. Where should the knight actually go if you're trying to salvage this with black? Yeah, suddenly people perk up because this is not an easy question. Now, I'm not checking the engine. I'm giving you my opinion. Very, very interesting because most of you are saying what I actually think is wrong. So most of you are saying knight e7, but how are you actually going to untangle after rook e1? How do you guys plan to like get your kingside out? I don't see a way. Black is totally paralyzed. If you fianchetto, I mean, I'm going to put my queen on e2. I will let you fianchetto, but how are you ever going to castle in this situation? I'm aiming at your knight on e7. And let me one up you. The knight will go from d4, and I'm threatening to jump into c6 using the pin on the knight. So maybe you can survive with the move king f8 in the nick of time getting the king away. This is one option. But my instinct with black is actually to put the knight on e5. And I think the reason this goes against the instinct of most players is that they see that the rook can go to e1, and they see that the knight is attacked 2 different times. It can hardly be defended. But my instinct with black would be just to give the pawn away. Chuck the pawn, but focus on the kingside development. So what move am I implying here? What is the professional approach toward ensuring that you're going to live to fight another day with black? Yeah, bishop e7. Yeah, this is a move a lot of people just would reject outright, bishop e7. But this is the GM approach. You say, okay, I'll let you have my pawn. This is not a good thing. Black is worse, obviously. But at least I get to castle, and in the next move, you're going to slide the bishop over to d6 and attack the rook. And the other bishop can come out to b7. So already very early on, you should understand that chess is about priorities, right? You have a situation, you made a mistake. At this point, your priority is to castle kingside, and it's worth giving up a pawn in order to achieve that. Knight e5 is like a temporary move that puts it's like when you put a cabinet or something against the door to prevent the door from being broken so you can run away. The door is going to be busted open, but it's going to give you just enough time to run away through the tunnel. And by the way, bishop b5 check, not scary because of bishop d7. Okay. So no, knight b8, knight b8 is the same thing. Rook e1 check, bishop e7, queen e2. And again, it's the same problem. There's nothing on the e-file, so you're never going to be able to castle here. And that doesn't mean the game ends, but this is just so ugly. Black has 0 prospects here. Also because the c6 square is such a weakness. Knight bd7, knight c6 is game over. And if you play bishop b7, then I go the other way. And again, the bishop on e7 is simply trapped. So, yeah, so I think knight e5 might be really the only feasible move here. But Knight b4, bishop b5 check, bishop d7, we take it. And this is all part of the same idea. We're threatening a3 and queen e2 with the fork. So black had to play king takes d7, the last chance to survive, with the point that now queen e2 is no longer a fork, and the knight can move away. This is still a terrible position for black, terrible position. And if you want to borrow a page from Wesley So's book against Hikaru Nakamura, in such situations, it is often very worthwhile to play the move b4 in order to restrict the knight. This is the concept of restriction. This is a very simple concept that you can even learn as a beginner. You use your pawns to control important squares. How do you know they're important? Well, it's the only square that the knight can move to that's not the pathetic b8 square. The knight is fully restricted. We can continue our development, and this is a horrendous position for black. Losing, objectively losing. Objectively losing. But after queen d7, yeah, we play a3, and then we pick up the knight, and then we end the game. And the rest of the game is very straightforward. I'm sure we'll get more of a chance to talk about conversion, but the important points here were, yeah, knight d4 is a nice move to get the knight into the center. Rook a b1, not being afraid to make these moves that don't look pretty but do a lot, right? We're just defending our pawn. And it's important not to give this pawn away. And then knight c6, noticing the discovery, and winning both rooks and taking the pawn, and then converting easily by promoting to a queen. And that's basically it. That's our first speedrun game. A simple game. Our opponent played pretty well for his rating, and I hope you guys enjoyed. So once again, those watching on YouTube, this was the first game of the fourth speedrun. The emphasis in this speedrun is going to be on openings. We're going to talk at length about my opening recommendations. I'm going to play the same stuff every game. I'm going to play e4 with white, King's Indian with black against d4, accelerated dragon, just like in the first speedrun with black against e4, backed by popular demand. I'm going to lay out all of my recommendations against all of the openings we face. And when we climb a little bit higher, maybe to 800, 900, we will start analyzing concrete openings and developing theory. With that, folks, this is going to be out on YouTube. Hopefully the reception will be good. I know the audio is scuffed. I'm in Toronto still. The next speedrun game will be from a better location. But for now, guys, I am going to sign off. Hope you enjoyed. Thanks to everybody for hanging out. Appreciate the support. In the meantime, see you guys.